Hello, everyone. Honorable speakers, dear participants, I hope we have because I can see them, and dear organizers. Greetings from the ICYF Eurasian Regional Center based in Baku, Azerbaijan. My name is Sevinç İskenderova. I am Deputy Director General in Eurasian Regional Center in Azerbaijan. Today's topic is engaged to be a woman in Islamic society. It's a very general topic actually, because we have topics like education of women in Islamic society, for example, or violence against women in Islamic society, or women activity in Islamic society. And today's topic is very general, and it allows to our speakers to speak a lot in different areas of this topic. And we know that most of the OIC countries have their organizations, foundations which support women issues, women education, fight against women violence in their society, in their countries. And of course, some of them really works they really may influence to some of group of people, but some of these kind of organizations and foundations may just only take their meetings in closed conditions, and that's why they have no any impact to the topic. And since its establishment, ICYF ERC, not ICYF ERC only, ICYF before ICYF DC, we try to engage more young girls, more women to our conferences. And especially we had at least one international conferences on women issue. It was based on education, it was based on women activity, it was based on women rights in Islam in order to counter the violence against women. And of course, we had middle sessions regarding women issues in different range of conferences. That was very important because we are gathering more people in different kind of international conferences, and it was very important us to engage women issue and women to the different conferences to make promotion on the topics. And beyond the conferences, we had long-term projects for women. It was devoted to raising their activities in their society, early marriages, education, unemployment. And one of them was to involve unemployed women to the private professions areas. It was sewing, it was carpet weaving, it was cooking, and it was babysitting. And it was long-term project, as I mentioned. And if you ask, was it helpful? I say yes. It was very helpful. I wish we could have more condition to continue this project, to restart this project in different areas, because most of them are already employed after this project, because we awarded them with a special certificate, so they could continue working in special mentioned areas. And I think that if we look into the statistics, less active women are based in Islamic society. And I think that we should make this kind of projects much more than just talk. Just talk, just discuss, just to make it in conferences. Of course, these are also important part of the promotion because we are organizations, we are like channels which reflect all of these problems to the society. So, which means that we can promote women issues in society. We can raise awareness of society regarding these issues. To be a woman in Islamic society, it's very difficult actually, because you also know you are living this society, and it's difficult rather than in other society because of sometimes they say that it's about religious, but believe me, it's not about religious. Because if it was about religious, then let's start from the Mecca. The Haram, the only one place in the world where both of the parts, male and female, can pray together. They are same in here together. Let's start, if we are talking about religious, that religious restricts women from something. No. If we are start, let's take a look to the Mecca pilgrims. Women and men are the same in there, which means that Allah gave us both the same range, power, activity. And I think that we should change our mental thoughts regarding the religion, because we are changing it day by day to another mentality. And I hope that this conference will be useful for the participants, and I hope that we can have chance to make it in big areas, and especially to engage young women and girls to unemployment projects. I mean, unemployed young girls and women to the projects where we can somehow teach them, where we can somehow give them opportunity to learn something for themselves, because some of them mostly uneducated, and they really need this kind of projects like sewing, because they can sew at their home without going out, because most of these projects were engaged to the women who are not educated. They cannot go out from their home, unfortunately. That's why we created this opportunity for them. And this was very useful project. And I really recommend to the society, to the organizations who really suffers from this kind of society, where women cannot go out to work, or most of them are uneducated. They can make this kind of projects with private sections, like sewing, carpet weaving, like cooking or babysitting. Dear men, I don't know if we have here or not. Because of her, first you opened your eyes, her power, her strong belief. You first opened your eyes to this world and breathed. Because of her care, you grew up in health conditions. Because of her insist, you took a school, you took classes, and you are educated, and you are empowered now. Because of her, your children are in safe when you are traveling a lot with your work, which means that women really great power in general in our lives. Let's support each other. Let's support women to be active, because women really supportive nature in this world, even for men, even for children. As a mother, the sister, the wife. So let's treasure our women and let's be engaged to raise awareness of women to be a part of, an active part of in their society. I wish to your online session, to this meeting, success, and hope to have together another big events in open area, in big halls. Thank you very much for invitation. And I think we will have another moderator who will take.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vince, for that beautiful opening statement. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, wherever you might be in the world, or whenever you're viewing this episode of OIC Youth Connect, created by National MOIC Pakistan in collaboration with the Eurasian Regional Center of ICYF. My name is Satsa Khan. I am the project manager of National MOIC Pakistan, and I will be serving as your moderator today for the fifth episode of OIC Youth Connect, titled To Be a Woman in an Islamic Society. If you're new here and haven't been following the series since we started it, I urge you to stick around. In this series, we talk to leading academicians and scholars from across the world about issues and challenges that concern the OIC geography. We try to raise discourses that we think are important to highlight and bring to the forefront of global discussions. Speaking of leading scholars, I have two esteemed guests with me today who I am so honored to welcome to the NMIC platform. We have with us Dr. Salim Ibrahim and Dr. Afia Zia. Dr. Salim Ibrahim is an accomplished scholar, author, educator, and spiritual leader. Her work has been published widely, and her contributions to enhancing cultural and religious literacy have been featured by prominent academic and media outlets. Dr. Ibrahim's scholarship and service have earned her awards and honors, including as a Mellon Fellow, a Harvard Presidential Scholar, an HRH Prince Al Walid bin Talal Fellow in Nonprofit Management and Philanthropy at the Islamic Society of North America, a fellow in the program on religion, diplomacy, and international relations at the Woodrow Wilson School, and a Davis Scholar at the Princeton University, among other honors. Her upcoming book, Women and Gender in the Quran, explores the various female figures mentioned in the Quran, along with some other essential themes. Thank you so much, Dr. Salim, for joining us today. We also have with us Dr. Afia Zia, who is a Pakistani feminist scholar who has worked extensively on gender politics and the domestic feminist movement in Pakistan as a member of Women's Action Forum. She is an experienced academician, gender specialist, and a feminist researcher with a doctoral degree in women and gender studies from the University of Toronto. She is the author of Faith and Feminism in Pakistan and has contributed essays to several edited volumes, including Contesting Feminism, Gender and Islam in Asia, and Voicing Demand. Her peer-reviewed essays have been carried in Feminist Review and the International Feminist Journal of Politics. She has taught at the University of Toronto and Hadith University, Karachi, and is an active member of the Women's Action Forum. Thank you so much for joining us today. I can express how happy I am to be in conversation with you guys. But before we get into it, I would like to speak about today's episode a bit. So from the beginning of time, women have left their marks on society. They have played an active role in changing the course of history at times. They have influenced significant spheres of life at others. Even in Muslim societies, extraordinary women worked alongside men to advance their communities. But when we look at things theoretically, too often history is written by men, for men, and about men, while women are highlighted solely as the mothers, wives, or daughters of these powerful men. So, why have the efforts of half of humanity been ignored by historians and social scientists? When we investigate and sift through literature, we find evidence that identify women as active participants and fully involved partners in historical events. Muslim women have contributed to the legacy of Islam as scholars, jurists, rulers, benefactresses, warriors, businesswomen, and legal experts. But how many of us know of the efforts of Sitata al-Mahmili, or of Labana of Cordoba of 10th century Spain, Sit al-Mulk of 11th century Egypt, Melik Mama Hatun of 12th century Turkey, or even Raja Sultana of 13th century India? Today, there are about 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. About 800 million, if not more, of that population are women. That is more than the combined population of some leading nations. So for today's episode, we hope to highlight four things. One, the empowered women of the past and their forgotten legacies. Two, some leading Muslim women of the 21st century who have overcome all obstacles and succeeded despite the odds. Three, glorify the successes and achievements of these women while acknowledging the hindrances they may have faced in reaching those pedestals. Four, the discourse on feminism in the Muslim society. We will reflect on the present day, how far we have come and how far we still need to go. I think that's enough by me. I would really like my speakers to start speaking. I'd like to start off with hearing a bit about your personal experiences, starting from where your expertise lies. What urged you to get into the field of women and gender studies? From what I know, in this part of the world specifically, very few individuals, whether it be women or men, think that a degree in gender studies is worth it. So what made you want to go down that path, and how has that choice rewarded you?
Should I start? Should I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't know if the question was for both of us. Or, well, in the American context, I grew up with a lot of messages about being an empowered girl, and I would do like push-up contests, and at that time I could win them against basically anybody. And so I grew up with a conception of empowerment that by the time that I reached my early 20s and was seeing more of the world, I realized that this discourse of girl empowerment was not necessarily something that would then carry through into my professional life, because I started noticing that my male colleagues would get promoted and doors would open in front of them, and it would be much more difficult for me. And at that same time, I'm a convert to Islam. And so I discovered Islam about that time. And what was fascinating to me was that I could locate sort of like proto-feminist principles in some aspects of Islam. And as someone who had studied a lot of different religions, for me, Islam stood out in that way, that the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam seem to contain in them a real elevation of the dignity and in some cases financial and social status of women. And so I was thinking about the discourses around girl empowerment and the ways in which, for instance, in the US, women are still compensated much less than men on average, and Black and brown women are almost compensated at rates like about 50% less than what white men, for instance, would be compensated at on average. And so I was thinking about structural issues in the American context related to womanhood, and bear in mind that women only received the vote about 100 years ago in the American context. And, and even until the 50s, I remember my grandmother telling me stories about how she had to have a male approval so she could open a bank account. She was like a corporate executive at that time, which was very rare, but she still had to have kind of male permissions to manage her money. And so I'm thinking about some of these dynamics in the American context, and thinking about what I saw in Islam, which was that women had financial, for instance, autonomy, and that many of the early women were incredible philanthropists, and it was inspiring to me personally. And at the same time, then I was also aware of as I was traveling around and experiencing different majority Muslim societies, I was aware of some of the ways in which what I saw as the ideals of Islam were not necessarily put into practice. And so I'll just give you one example and then turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Zia. One example, for instance, is the stigma on divorced women. So if I just read the Quran, there's an encouragement for divorced women to remarry, for instance. And as I was traveling around majority Muslim societies, I was noticing this, that women who remarried faced a stigma for remarrying. I mean, this is just one example of how sometimes the principles of Islam don't get applied in practice to women's detriment.
Dr. Afia, would you like to add to that?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. And it's really interesting to hear from Celine because, you know, we're on across the world, different parts of the world, and our experiences are also almost diametrically opposed in some ways, because my involvement and inclusion in the women's movement in Pakistan came about not through necessarily through an awareness of, you know, societal inequalities, which it may for others, but I grew up in a very specific period of Islamization, a sort of a revivalist movement around the Muslim world, and particularly in Pakistan and the Ziaul Haq, where women became the markers of identifying Pakistan as an Islamic republic, similar to many other countries. And I think it's interesting how we use terms as well. You know, I really don't know what Islamic societies are. I know what Islamic republics are. I know what Muslim majority countries are, what Muslim contexts are, what Muslim minorities are, Muslim diaspora. But we use terms interchangeably. And sometimes that also throws our identities, you know, and so what I'm saying is that my identity was shaped very much as a feminist in resistance to the state, the Pakistani state under a military dictatorship, deciding what women's roles and what women's relationship with religion should be, imposing an Islamic identity on us, you know. So we shifted in Pakistan from being a modern Muslim women's identity, which is what happened when Pakistan first came into being, and we were moving towards an Islamic nationalist kind of identity, you know. So that's a different shift. Pakistan has never had necessarily a stigma associated with certain, you know, very early on, because of certain, this quest for modernity in Pakistan opened up and was perhaps a far more progressive space for Muslim women to build their rights. So the Muslim family laws of Pakistan are one of the more progressive ones around the Muslim world, etc. There was a backlash during General Ziaul Haq's period, and that, I think, conscientized a lot of women to become resist the state and resist discriminatory laws, to resist discrimination in general, and you know, there were very few at that time who were, there were women who were scholars in particular, who were then looking for what is the identity that Muslim women in Pakistan should now follow if we do not accept something called Western feminism, or we don't want to deal with specifically just colonial laws. These are not appropriate for Muslims, or whatever the debates were. There were lots of debates at the time. So some were looking for rights by reclaiming, as Celine says, reclaiming women's roles in history, in Islamic history, in Muslim history, while others, a very strong women's movement was claimed a secular identity, by which they meant that we are not looking for rights within a certain historic period, pre-modern sort of Islam, but instead we look for it in universal human rights norms, and adapt them and make them applicable to our context. And of course, feminists, as you know, do not accept, you know, a sort of a male-defined norms or male-defined rights. So the idea was that we will look for our identities, not necessarily in religion, but in our class identities, in our gendered identities, and our identities across ethnicities in Pakistan, because we are different. So I think very much my relationship with the women's movement, with feminism, and with the Pakistani state, sort of was very, very sort of inward, not necessarily influenced by. I know there's a tendency to say feminism is all Western. You know, I never lived in the West. I didn't get it from the West. I didn't even read texts necessarily when I was, 13, 14. But it was a political environment that shaped my feminism in Pakistan.
Keep forgetting to unmute myself. Things are different for women in the West and for women in most Muslim societies. I think that Pakistan is still relatively progressive, but that's not the case for all other Muslim societies. Given that the dynamics of society vary greatly in terms of societal roles, expectations, and even things like financial independence, that is so essential in the West, but it is sort of deemed as a taboo in this part of the world. So, Dr. Celine, I'd like to ask you, how greatly do you think that these notions, these sentiments or values that we have in the East affect a woman's personal and professional growth?
It's hard. I think as Dr. Zia pointed out, that local histories matter, that a woman's own background matters, to the extent that what opportunities are available, what education, what professional opportunities are available. So it's very hard to speak in the general about a question like this. And I mean, I'll maybe just say that one of the things that to me was very inspiring about the opening speaker's comments was that idea of empowering women through skills-based labor so that they can be income generators for their family. And that to me, in terms of thinking big picture, is a good strategy. It seems like a good way forward. And of course, that's happening in all different projects around the world. And I think if we're thinking about what about this is relates to the heritage of Islam, one of the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she was engaged in craftsmanship and would sell her works. And so we have a model for this, even not that I take Dr. Zia's point well, that we don't necessarily have to find a model for everything in some type of Islamic historical reality, but for some people that is inspiring to know that a wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was indeed a craftswoman and made an income for herself off selling her products.
Dr. Afia, you have grown up in the East. Do you want to add to that? Can you specify how a woman's personal and professional growth is affected by these sentiments that we have?
No, I just wanted to comment, on Celine's point. I think that it's absolutely, it's a fair point to say that, looking for models in Islamic heritage is something that catches the imagination, and it becomes a useful tool for women's rights proponents or advocates in Muslim contexts, whether they're Muslim minorities or they are in Muslim majority countries. But the complication or the difficulty is, or the limitations are, that there's a difference between empowerment, as our opening speaker was mentioning. There's a difference between empowerment and autonomy. And I think this is where the difference between women's rights and feminism comes in. So if Islam and Islamic heritage is rooted in a tribal culture, necessarily, this is centuries ago, and of course there were limits to women's rights even then. If we keep stressing and depending on models and histories, there's a limit to how far we can get in terms of the demands and the rights that we seek today in the modern and now in the globalized world. So the difficulty, and I think the challenges that we face today as Muslim women fighting, resisting, and looking for rights, resisting patriarchy, is that we then look for alternatives, and we get squeezed between this narrative or this accusation that we are looking for Western rights, for feminism is a Western concept. and as if we can only be limited to models, excavating Islam for looking for our rights and looking at Islamic history only. That's a very limiting and project. And one of the things that the repercussions of that is that it then pushes us towards development paradigms or development models, which is that because Muslims and Muslim women appreciate and want to be segregated, gender segregation is the norm, is the Muslim norm. Therefore, we should push Muslim women towards home-based work or work that they are comfortable with, or arts and crafts, or, and I think this is an unfortunate trend that it's not OIC alone, it's, Western donors and humanitarian organizations. They tend to stamp Muslim women with this, it's a sort of a re-stigmatization and a limitation. And what we have been arguing for, the reason that we want to talk about a more secular or non-religious base or model for women, Muslim women around the world, is so that they are not limited to just fitting in, being appreciated, being, conforming to a kind of a male-defined understanding of what rights are. For me, these are not consensual rights. They are something that is comfortable. It doesn't challenge or resist patriarchy. It fits in with patriarchy. And of course, the danger of that is then you are boosting or encouraging patriarchy and just negotiating some space within it. So feminism is not about negotiating, it's about transforming towards autonomy. And that's the discomfort and the debate, I think, that comes with, that is raised time and again in Muslim contexts or with regard to Muslim women's rights.
Yeah, I think I just want to pick up on that because I'm realizing now in this conversation how much, for instance, my perspective, I'm grounded in a Western framework of rights. And so, for instance, if I want to go get a divorce, I love my husband, I'm not intending to do that, but if I wanted to, that would be a fairly simple thing for me. So I think for the Western Muslim context, it's very different because our struggle for rights is more a struggle against state surveillance and discrimination based on our Muslimness. And so it's a very different context for what that looks like. So for instance, for me, it's a struggle just to be able to wear a scarf, and in a lot of places, for instance, it's a struggle against state mandates on women's dress in that way. So there's a I think our life experiences are really interestingly juxtapositioned, but one of the things I really take, Afia, from your points there, that emphasis on total transformation and sort of not settling for just the crumbs that are thrown as a way of getting what we can. And one of the things I wonder with that is that transformation. It's a long game project, but how does that? How do you resist the temptation maybe to take small gains to hold out for that bigger, more transformative moment or possibility?
So I think that's an absolutely fair question. It is in fact, it's tempting to take the short term, the quick. And trust me, there are no pure streams that run in any of these contexts. It's not as if both things don't happen simultaneously. There are groups within our countries and our societies who do take the short term, who do negotiate, who do compromise, or whatever you want to call it. But I think it is imperative to have those who are more radical, who are not fitting in or to our understanding of non-Western feminism, or who are uncomfortable, those who are uncomfortable with the term feminism. At the very least, we should be appreciating the fact instead of discrediting. And I think one of the problems with scholars, recent scholars, I think in the post 9/11 period, there's been a lot of reckoning and a lot of rethinking about And one of the calls or one of the arguments have been that, you know, we reject something called liberal secularism. We reject Western feminisms. There's been this kind of defensiveness, and I think that's a who are the winners and losers in that game, right? So at the very least, it's important to correct and to legitimize the movements that are more radical, the movements that are asking for equality, secular equality, liberal rights, so as not to lose the larger term, the larger vision games that you mentioned. The idea is what we need to reclaim is an appreciation for the very different layers of rights-based discourse. The problem, Celine, is that very often they clash. Mm. And when they clash, it becomes very convenient for patriarchy to push these or posit these as women fighting women, you know, the right wing, and it becomes a really interesting visual also. Hijab observing women versus, you know, non-chadar or jeaned women, and that becomes the dominant discourse. And I think it only benefits patriarchy or men in that game. So I think there is a need for dialogue. Now, one of the um, advocates, or one of the streams that has come out of this has been the Islamic feminist, you know, sort of a hybrid proposal for a hybrid regime or a hybrid way for Muslim women to gain rights. The issue with that is that it becomes a kind of exceptionalizing Muslim women, as if Muslim women have different kinds of needs, different rights. You know, this is my problem with looking for rights exclusively within an Islamic discourse. So when we talk about hybridity, there's a sort of a reliance or a dependence or a encouragement of both streams to borrow from each other and to not to discredit each other in that sense. I think there is a limitation. That's my bias. There is a limit to how many rights you can excavate within the Islamic discourse, and I think it goes it can offer strategic leverage. It can be strategically useful in Muslim contexts. But I think that if it's ultimately limiting and you're not bringing in class and you're not bringing in race and you're not bringing in, you know, sexual autonomies, if, you know, and I think a lot of Islamic feminists circumvent that. It's an uncomfortable subject matter, and nobody wants to concede that their project is limited in that sense, you know. So I think that uncomfortable conversation, that's not being had. And I do hold responsible those donors or those academies that encourage this bifurcation, in the sense that they will fund projects which are looking for Islamic rights or Islamic feminist rights or Islamic courses, you know, all of that, and pretend that feminism has no space or legitimate expression in Muslim contexts, right? So it becomes a fad, it becomes a fashionable route to take. And I think that that's not useful politically for us. And even scholarship that has come out recently, which focuses on Islamic feminism and how Muslim women have agency, the pietist movements in Muslim contexts, yes, they have agency, but should why are we so defensive about criticism about the limits of that agency, right? Pietist movements also help patriarchy, and if I should say so, there is a tremendous defensiveness and backlash and delegitimization that then goes on. Not, I mean, it's not a personal issue, but about this vision or this critique. And I think that's the unfortunate. We're getting channeled and we're getting squeezed into one, as if Muslim women can only pursue one type of rights-based discourse.
So building up from what you just said, Dr. Afia, I have been calling myself a feminist since I was about 14 or 15 years old. And since then, whenever I mention that I'm a feminist to my peers, the first thing I experience is backlash. As you said, that's the first thing you experience whenever you say the F word. And this has been happening for the past 10 or so years. And I've been working with NMOIC for 3 years now. And from that platform also, I've built connections with Muslim youth across the globe. And everywhere, the sentiment seems to be the same, that feminism is all about man hating. And it's even a large amount of women believe this. And because of that, they're afraid of calling themselves feminists because they think it's all about, hating an entire gender. So I want to ask you, where do you think that this notion goes from? Why is everyone under the impression that feminists hate men when that's not the case at all?
So, Sijda, one of the this is not specific to just Muslim women, right? I mean, any woman around the world, even in my generation, when you claim an identity, it sets off certain anxieties amongst those who do not want to give up the status quo, their power, or it do not want to be challenged. So for example, when Celine says that, for her to even observe the hijab, which is a piece of cloth for any non-Muslim, sort of observant, she becomes a symbol that makes them anxious, right? Certain associations in their mind, because they're going to give up, they feel that the incursion is on their space, on their identities, on what it is to be American, etc., etc. So the same thing with feminism. Feminism is a political ideology. It is a political project for equality. And if you're going to challenge those who maintain the status quo, men, powerful men, upper class men, Sunni men, if you're going to challenge them and ask for more rights, they will have to give up certain privileges and rights to make it more equal. Of course, if you take away something from someone, a power tool, they're going to be anxious and they're going to discredit it. This is the whole process of discrediting and delegitimizing. So, and the best way to do it is to otherize you, as we know, right? All Muslims are potential terrorists. All feminists are homebreakers, asking for. So this is something that we should be way past, right? There's so much written on it, but it's easier. It's much easier to say that we've written about it and the discourse is out there and it's all available on internet. When it comes into practice, that's what I'm mentioning to Celine, that we can, as Muslim women, we can claim to be sisters, we can claim to be on the same side, but there are certain hurdles when we face them, practical, material concerns. That's when the debate gets heated, and that has been unresolved. And I do not agree at all with this idea of, for example, I'm not just to be critical of them, but when international organizations like the OIC organize conferences which are for women, it's women debating, it's not even debating, it's like-minded women who come together, read some papers out and go back. We're so fearful of debate. We are so fearful of integrating men and women. Why should there be an OIC women's conference? Why can't men be in the audience and listening to what women leadership in the OIC is asking for? So I think, and why are women always expected to talk about women's issues? Why can they not be talking about oil? Why can't they be talking about the economies of the Middle East? Why can't we be talking about indentured labor that comes from non-Arab countries like Pakistani labor in the Middle East? And I think we fall into this trap as well. We need to expand and not be fearful of debate, not discredit each other's perspectives, and be sort of more brave in our voices, not just in the everyday bravery that we be and the politics that we conduct anyway. So I think this fear of feminism is a good thing. I sort of claim it, I embrace it. I tell them, yes, you should be worried about feminism. It is a dangerous philosophy because it's an equalizing one. So embrace it. Don't worry about that.
Thank you, Dr. Afia. Um, my next question is for Dr. Celine. Dr. Celine, we constantly hear that Islam has given women all the rights that they need, but very often religions and cultures tend to clash, and rights given by religion appear very differently when dictated by culture. And in the first place, from my experience, I don't really see a lot of female religious scholars anyway. What we know about religion is predominantly from what male scholars have told us. So how far do you think that we have come in terms of claiming the rights that women have been given by religion? Do you think that women in Muslim societies are empowered, or does that vary from region to region as well?
Yeah, I think this has to be a little bit of a both and. answer because I don't want to overlook the fact that, for instance, education has been a pillar of kind of Islamic consciousness for women as well as men. And this is important because if we look at you know, in a comparative perspective to different religious or cultural frameworks, we find that women were discouraged or even forbidden in some contexts from seeking an education. So there's certain aspects that we can lift up and say this gave us as Muslims thinking about a legacy of women's involvement in discourses of you know, religious discourses. So we've been there, but we've been at the margins, and there's no contesting the fact that if you ask someone to name a famous tafsir book written by a woman, they'd have to, you know, go for someone in the contemporary period or you know, the 1950s perhaps. But so we've been excluded from the discourses, as you mentioned, and I sometimes in conversation with some of my male colleagues who are not really seeing the extent of the marginalization, I have to challenge them to go to their bookshelf and choose all the books that are written by a woman on their shelf. And of course, they're going to come back with only books pretty much in the modern period. And then oftentimes revert to women's legacy as hadith transmitters, which is, you know, again, we have to say it's a both and. Yes, women were there, and yes, they were transmitting hadith. But if we look, I want to cite the work of Asma Sayyid, who is a historian and looked at this women's transmission of hadith, and she finds that in the very early period, women, for instance, Aisha radiallahu anha, transmitted almost, you know, more hadith than any other person, save two, and so, or save one even perhaps. And so there was more of an autonomy, I think, to use Afia's language here. And in later centuries, women are reproducing what has already been compiled and canonized by male scholars. So even though we do have women's transmission, and we have it on large scale, evidence of large scale women's transmission, it's not authorial creation. This is not, you know, this is transmission. And so there's a difference there. So you can say, well, this is women fitting into a patriarchy while, you know, being on pushed to the margins. And you find even in Islamic history where you do find tremendous women scholars, oftentimes they were daughters of prominent scholars. And so it relies on, you know, the system as it functions seemed to rely on the beneficence of a male who decided to empower his female child rather than sort of an autonomous legacy of women's kind of religious authority. I'm not sure if that quite answered your question. That was more, you know, thinking historically. And the present moment, let me just add a footnote to this. The present moment, I think, in terms of women's religious leadership, I'll just speak from what I see in the American context. A number of foundations, most of them historically Christian, set up in recent years endowments and grant funding for women to be kind of program administrators and faculty in theological programs. Now, these are theological programs in historically Western institutions, but at the same time, you know, just this investment of usually as historically Christian money in Christian institutions, but for Muslim women scholars has actually enabled a lot of the people who are writing, a lot of my colleagues and me, I also had one of those funded positions, enabled us to do the work that we're doing. And so what makes me sad about this is that this was not Islamic, this is not Muslim funding saying that we need Muslim scholars. This was historically Christian institutions deciding that we need more Muslim scholars, and the result, I think it plays into some of these dynamics that Afia was mentioning around my ability. I just produced a work. It's essentially, it's very similar to a work of tafsir. I'm doing really original interpretation of women figures in the Quran. My time to write that project would not be possible without the investment from these, kind of Western, let's just call them Western or Western Christian foundations. So it sets me at a really interesting place. And I'm not the only one. There's a number of women who have held these chairs.
It's a process that I've written about, and I call it donor-driven Islam. And I think, I appreciate the candid, sort of way that you've explained it, because, part of our critique of this is that it's actually a project to almost produced for Western audiences as well. Funding always has strings attached to it. And of course, they would lend brilliant scholarly insight. There's no question about the value of this scholarship. And it's very interesting for academics like myself. But I think when we attempt to translate it on the ground, or in our work, or in our activism, that's where it becomes a sort of a limitation for feminists to unpack these, to make them to link them with practical material issues. And the other issue, Celine, is that, like I was saying earlier, that because feminism's core concern, and certainly mine, is that, we look at issues from a class perspective as socialist feminists, for example, in Pakistan or other socialists. Our concern is that we're not looking at these issues from there's no critique of capitalism that is recently coming out in Islamic feminist literature. There is in Islamic literature, certainly, or in Muslim scholarship, earlier scholarship. So I think that's a key concern. So what that leaves us with is some people who are working on Muslim family laws, for example, and even there's great contention. And, centuries later, you talked about the short and the long-term game, but, centuries later, we're still debating what is the age of consent for Muslim women's marriages, right? So how much more long-term do we want to go on this, and so it's kind of cyclical, and it sustains us, and it enables some of us to get a foot into Western, sort of academia and Western think tanks, etc. But I'm not sure that for the majority or the bulk or the lumpen Muslims, what the heck is coming out of that for us? And I think that's where the worry about the priorities and whether they are syncing in with each other or not, I still am skeptical about that. The other point that I think is important that you mentioned is the other missing link. So one is this lack of critique of capitalism. The other is there's no discussion on Muslim women's sexualities. And this is a huge challenge too. If we are going to keep pretending that, Muslim body of work or Islamic discourse does not put a premium on modesty, Muslim women's sexual modesty, then we will continue to perpetuate this idea of a segregation or certain ways of gender. The Islamic gendered order will perpetuate a kind of separation, policing of women's bodies, and pretending that, this is not an issue for real Muslims or for Muslims who are alive and looking and seeking for ways to cope and to deal with globalization and the world today. So that's another question mark. And forget stigma on divorce. There's a huge stigma on Muslim men and women who are practicing, or experimenting with sexualities, or who have sexual relationships which are considered to be transgressions. And in many cases, the pressure is to punish them for it. So, I find this also interesting in terms of choice of scholarship, the choice of subject matter, which is for feminist, as a feminist, it concerns me that it's not looking at capitalism and it's not looking at sexualities, which are real, immediate, urgent issues that Muslims and Muslim women and Muslim youth in around the world are facing. Where's the discourse on that?
Yeah, I think to that point, I think it ties back to your earlier comments about some people's rights are other people's losses. And so there's an idea of in this, an ideal Islamic society, what that looks like and how people behave in that society. And so this is the tension between a recognition of people's sexual rights with this conception of this idealized conception of what an Islamic society looks like. And I'm not sure that there's a point of reconciliation between those two, because it seems like it's a very, the demands are very mutually exclusive. And so it's very incredibly challenging. I used to work as a university chaplain. And as a chaplain in the university, I'm of course a welcoming presence for all Muslims. This is, we have non-discrimination by law. So if I'm an employee of the university, I cannot enforce a sort of, it is not my job. It is kind of contrary to my role to reinforce kind of Islamic sexual norms. Right, and at the same time, I have a lot of students looking to me to be the model of what normative Islam should look like, and I mean, this is just in my context, in a small, polity. But if we expand that out, I'm really not sure I see a way forward on this question. I don't know. How.
Actually, your book should be about that experience.
Actually, I mean, just to name this, I saw a lot of things working as a chaplain, and most of it I can't really talk about other than the generals. But there you see a tremendous struggle between people receiving a version of what they should be and how they should act, and knowing that, and the kind of knowing who they are authentically, and not just on sexuality, but on any number of things. That kind of gap between the idealized Muslim and who people discover themselves to be. A lot of my chaplaincy work was in trying to help people, essentially figure out who did they want to be among all of these kind of competing narratives of what success in life meant. But in a way, it's a microcosm for the tremendous pressures. I mean, I can speak as someone who tries to imbibe sort of an Islamic morality as best I can, and as I interpret it. There's always, you're always situated in a shortcoming, because you can never really be that idealized version. I missed Fajr this morning, for instance. And so at the same time, there's for me a tremendous spiritual anchoring and power that I derive from my identity sort of as a Muslim, in terms of how it relates to my spiritual practice and my psychology and my ability to persevere in difficult circumstances. And so I'm always holding out between these two, this very high standard of Islamic morality, and the sense that I am in fact fed by not just my own personal pious practice, but my association with a number of other people who care about justice issues from within an Islamic framework.
Okay. So, Dr. Celine, as you mentioned, you're writing a book on a woman and gender in the Quran, where you explore the various female figures mentioned in the Quran. So, I want to ask sort of question away from the discourse that we're having, but if you could have a conversation with one empowered Muslim woman from the past, who would it be and why? And the same question goes to you, Dr. Afia.
One of the things that I highlight in my book is that there's no idealized single version of a Muslim woman. You find, even in the Quranic examples, you find young women, old women, poor women, aristocrats. You find, women who are spouses. You find women who are not. Find women with children, women without. So there's this tremendous variety of the examples that the Quran gives us. You find exceedingly pious women. You find women who are exceedingly corrupt, and so the woman, whatever woman that I would want to talk to, depends a lot on my circumstances, and that's, I think, the one of the things that I'm trying to resurrect, that it's not for me about identifying with just one, but that the fact that, whatever my circumstances are, there is a woman in sacred history that I can look to and say, oh, here's a, there's a way of relating to this woman's experience. I think the one I'll just lift up right now is the mother of Moses, Musa alayhi salam. And the reason I choose her in this moment is because she had to essentially escape a dictator by taking these actions to throw her child in the river, and this trust that she kind of was instilled with in her heart, that this was the action, the best course of action in an area where there were not a lot of possibilities. And I think that experience kind of abstracted of being between very bad possibilities and just having to trust one's gut instinct in terms of what is the best option, and that it will, in fact, hopefully work out in the end. And that's sort of a message that I take into a lot of aspects of my life, when there's not an idealized way forward, that I just have to kind of trust my gut, or trust the wahi, as it says in the Quran, like that internal sense of inspiration.
Dr. Afia, would you like to add to that?
It looks like her video is frozen.
Yeah, I think we've lost her. That's okay.
She might be logging back in, but
yeah, exactly. Her internet must have disconnected, but all right. So Mr. Taba Tariq has joined us. She is the country coordinator for ICYF. Welcome, Taba. Hi.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you are. All right. I'm just going to go to the last question now. So we have a lot of youth watching us today. In fact, majority of our audience is the youth. So what message do you have for them? I know that the way has been paved significantly already, but what work remains? What work remains for the leaders of tomorrow? And I would also like you to include a little message for their male counterparts, because obviously he's part of society as well. Also, what would you like to say to them?
Yes, I would say that there's a lot of work to be done, but I think each person has to really find the work that brings them the most joy, because there's a lot of problems, and we could be mired in trying to solve problems, or we can get really easily frustrated with all of the obstacles that there are to progress, and all of the forces that are trying to undo what we see as the good work that we're trying to do. And so if whatever it is, whatever way to be productive and engaged, and it has to be a work of joy, otherwise it's very difficult to sustain.
Thank you, Dr. C. Dr. Afia, would you like to take up the last question again?
Sorry, I got disconnected for a bit. Just repeat the question. I will.
So the question was, if you could have a conversation with one empowered woman from the past, who would it be?
I agree with what Celine said in the beginning that, I'm not somebody who lives in the past, or I'm neither a historian nor am I a sort of the kind of feminist who looks at histories necessarily in terms of looking for role models. But certainly when we teach gender studies and when we teach women's studies, these are important markers, and it's important to show a lineage of resistance. And I think particularly when Muslim women are viewed as either passive or oppressed, these are important historical correctives. And I think feminist historiography is invested in the idea that we should correct all kinds of histories, male written, male interpreted histories. That's an important part of the project. But as I keep saying that for a futuristic or for a feminist advocacy, these are sort of limited projects. They do need to be, these are political projects. And for them, the role of histories will sometimes need to be contested. And so sometimes when we find uncomfortable pieces of information from the past, we will need to have the courage to say that this is no longer applicable. And that's a dangerous project because of the divinity of religion. And it's impossible to challenge, sort of divine sources without getting a backlash or getting a pushback. It can even be, outright dangerous in some time. So I think we need to recognize that modernity has been a game changer for women's issues, for women's rights. And how much do we want to sync our historical trajectory of feminist resistance to the past, and how much do we want to look at the present challenges and see the practicalities of those and envision something that is beyond and above our religious identities. We can't always be contained within our Muslimness. I worry about young people who see this as their primary identity, because I think there are other identities which are far more compelling and should be for their future. As I said, class identities, racial identities, where when you're not in a Muslim majority context, or even where you are, and your sexual identities, these are everyday routine challenges, and religion does provide a coping mechanism to deal with the challenges that you face, but it should not be the single lens or the only resource available to you. We must broaden sort of the rights-based discourse, and not just have a passive acceptance or retreating into piety, for example. For me, that's not a conducive or a helpful way to change society. It fits in and it conforms to, and that makes me uncomfortable. Conformity makes me really uncomfortable.
Just to be clear, I didn't really mean religious figures. It could have been anyone. The point of that was just to highlight some figures. But with that said, Dr. Afia, what would your message be to the youth that is watching this right now? You're muted.
So to young people everywhere, regardless of what background, what religious background or non-religious background they come, I do urge them to locate their quest for justice. That's a common sort of pursuit that we can recognize across the world, and for that justice to locate their gender and class identities, and not privilege their religious ones, which separate us. In terms of gender and class, there are far more of us who have a larger cause, and I think it's important to focus on economic equality and gender equality, and to be more inclusive. You know, I think that I know that as Muslims, we say that it is, and it is in fact the easiest religion to come into the fold. It's easy to practice. There's not much requirement of it, to be fair. But instead, what I find Muslims doing is to make a career out of it, to make it a category where the criteria to this membership has become so high and difficult that it's becoming exclusive rather than inclusive, you know. And I think that's unfortunate when you make members unequal, whether they're women or they're different sects or they're not Sunnis, you make it exclusive, you will have fewer members joining. So I urge young people to be more inclusive, to look at other identities other than their religious ones, and not to reify it, not to make it difficult, but to bond together. There's a lot of injustices out there which are not based on religion or which will not be solved through religious paths or religious argumentation. I think it's important to focus on that and to maximize our energies towards that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Afia. I really want to thank both of you for joining us today and honoring us with your unmatched intellect. I, for one, have learned a lot. I have a lot to look upon and read upon thanks to your conversation today. With that said, we have Ms. Rutaba Tariq with us. She will be giving the closing statement to the session.
Yeah, so I'm assuming I'm audible. I'm really sorry. The rain has started in Karachi and it's very unforgiving. You lose electricity almost immediately and your internet connection's terrible following that. But I'm going to try and keep it short, seeing that the conversation has already been very long.
Her speaker is on mute.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. My internet's horrible. So I'm going to say 2 lines. I think the conversation was brilliant. I think it was critical, it was candid, it was very civil. You could really hear both sides of the story and you were really being challenged. Your core ideologies were being challenged. If anything, I think that is how conversations should be. They should challenge you from within and without. And if the dust settles and you feel like you had the right convictions, you'll have more confidence in what you believed in from the very beginning. If not, then I think you need to reevaluate where you are heading. That being said, I think there are important notes that both men and women can make following the conversation. The one thing that I think was overarchingly very true about the conversation was we need to stop thinking in binaries, right? Whether it's the binary of West or East, whether it's the binary of religion or not. I think binaries are very damaging when you study society and most of all if you study gender. I had a lot more to say, but I'm going to keep it short. I just want to thank my guests, Dr. Afia, Dr. Celine. You have been both brilliant and inspirational. And like Sajda said, we have a lot to learn and look into after this conversation. I also want to thank Sajda. She's a volunteer at National Model OIC, but she held her grace and took the conversation brilliantly. So great work there, Sajda. Thank you to my team who's working behind. And I hope I get more chances to be able to do this again with all of you. But thank you once again. And Sivanj, of course, I'm missing Sivanj. She also gave the opening statement. Obviously, without ERC, this would not have been possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.